Okay, I'm going to get started. So, welcome everybody. Today's Moatcast is a themed Q&A, and the theme is writing genre fiction. In a moment, I'm going to give you my opening thoughts on what is a very broad topic. Thanks, Craig. Does Craig sound as echoey to everyone else as he does to me? Another project squirrel. A little, but Scott says no echo. Okay, cool. So it's probably some effect of being a co-host that I'm getting as much echo as I am. So we won't worry about that too much. So thanks very much, Craig. I'm going to talk to you all a little about genre now. Feel free to ask your questions using the questions tab under the video feed. Ask your questions as soon as they occur to you. We aren't too numerous today, so it shouldn't be too difficult to stay organized and stay focused. After my introduction, I'll ask Craig to give you his thoughts about genre, and in particular about the genre he's chosen for his work in progress. And after that, we'll proceed to answer a few questions, and we'll, I guess, just take it from there fairly organically. So, in the previous webinar, I alluded to the idea that genre existed as a means of segregating fiction socially. The 20th century was a century of reorganization of social class, and societies that were highly stratified, so highly divided on the basis not just of wealth and education, which I mentioned last time, and not only on the basis of visible markers like gender and skin color, but also national identity, family background, even occupation. So for instance, in the UK, it was quite common for working people to distinguish themselves between whether they were labourers, artisans, professionals, and each one had their own identity. In the 20th century, the lines between all of that started to blur, which I think is a good thing. In this session, it'll help us to start with a definition of genre as it pertains in particular to fiction. Feel free to give your own definitions of genre while I speak. You can argue about that in the chat, and Craig and I will respond if necessary. I'm going to limit myself to what I'm going to call a utilitarian definition that suits, I think, the current publishing marketplace. Genre has a purpose for three different actors. Their purposes overlap, but they don't always agree. First, the people that I always put first, which is the readers. For readers today, genre is a means of limiting choice. I'll come back to the importance of limiting choice. But to begin with, picture yourself as a reader, just for a moment. I always assume that all serious writers are avid readers, but I'm aware that there are some excellent writers who read for pleasure only rarely. But what I want you to do is just think as readers. You've just finished reading a book that you enjoyed, and you'd like to read something else in the same vein. And the first thing you do is look up the author to see if they've written anything else. The second thing you do is look for similar authors. But what does similar authors even mean? What we hope is that it means that people who like the author you've just read will recommend other authors that you'll also like. But beyond this, as a reader, you have millions of books to choose from. And the best means of reducing that choice is to do so using genre. So genre, as it relates to readers, is often used as if it's a description of the readers themselves. We say a fantasy fan, an SF reader, an avid reader of Harlequin romance. But the reality is that a reader who usually makes a beeline for the fantasy section in the bookstore is doing so because they're a fan of fantasy. But that's not really the most useful way of describing it. It's more useful to think of it in terms of the books that they like are usually described as fantasy. So genre for the reader is more a description of the books they like than it is a description of the reader themselves. Keep thinking as a reader. Do you only like books from one genre? I think most readers read several genres. So the second group of actors are the ones that most people put last, the booksellers. Booksellers, for me, is anyone in the publishing industry who isn't an author or an editor. Everyone else's job is exclusively to sell books. Editors need to know a minimum about selling, and most authors need to know at least a little bit about how to write what sells. And if you pay attention, you'll realize that I constantly talk about how to write what sells, just in my own particular way. Booksellers need genre because for them it's a means of narrowing channels of communication. I'm going to waffle a little bit about advertising here, so you can switch off if you don't find this interesting. It's about narrowing channels of communication. It's about targeting. When you spend a lot of money advertising to a small number of people, you'll sell more products than if you spend the same amount of money as advertising to a large number of people. A lot of people think this is counterintuitive, but the devil is in the detail, as always. You have to choose a small number of people to advertise to. You have to choose them, the small number of people to advertise to. You have to strategize the way you spend your money. And it's easier to use multiple strategies. It's more effective, in fact, to use multiple strategies within a small target group than to use them with a large one. The main reason being, with a large target group, most of your spend is on reach. That's getting the message to everyone. When the target group is small, you can reach the same people in a wide variety of ways. This may not be news to you. It's been common knowledge in the advertising business since before the internet. In fact, since before global markets existed. Genre matters to booksellers because it enables them to narrow their target market. So let's say book A meets the basic criteria for fantasy fiction. So readers looking for fantasy will at least be curious about book A. Book B meets the basic criteria for science fiction. So readers looking for science fiction will also be curious about book B. Many readers of fantasy also read science fiction. There are subgenres of both that look as if they can belong in the other genre. For instance, is steampunk science fiction or fantasy, or a genre in its own right? Or what about alternative history? That can sometimes look like fantasy. It could sometimes look like science fiction. Booksellers themselves, they don't give themselves that kind of headache because they don't really care what genre means. What matters to them is that in the process of buying a book, a reader sees a limited choice when looking at any given category. The third group of actors are you guys, the authors. For authors, genre is a blessing and a curse. There's a kind of romantic ideal that you write if you write a book without thinking about genre, then once published, people will start describing it as one genre or another, and you can allow its classification to drift until it settles somewhere. But this won't help your agent pitch it to publishers, and it will severely limit your sales if you self-publish. Pragmatically, the author has got to choose a genre. The only choice that remains to you is, do you choose the genre before you start writing, or do you choose it after you finish? Many authors, unfortunately, try to do something in between. The books I've been reading recently, this is what they tell me. The books I've been reading recently have all been of this particular genre, and I want to write something similar. But I don't want to be limited by the rules and conventions of genre, and if the story turns out to be something else, then I'll just go with it. So this is where, I think I'm quoting Shakespeare twice in this script. This is where I quote him for the first time, and I say to them, infirm of purpose. That's Lady Macbeth, by the way. There seem to be a lot of opportunities to use that line at the moment, but I really mean it. The infirmity of purpose leads, to quote Shakespeare again, to something that is neither fish nor flesh. One knows not where to have it. And any difficulty of choice, so any difficulty of choice you have, any difficulty of choice the bookseller has, anywhere down the line translates directly and proportionally to a difficulty making a sale or winning a fan. For the author, genre serves two clear, simple purposes. Firstly, it imposes boundaries on your imagination. The more arbitrary limits you impose on your creative effort, the more inventive, the more original, the more distinctive your work will be. For a lot of people, that's counterintuitive. Surely, as the straw man I've just invented will protest, surely, if you have to write within strict conventions, your book will resemble everything else in the same genre. Well, I reply to my straw man, this is true only if you're either a very good writer or a very bad one. If you have the kind of creative urge that drives people to set down hundreds of thousands of words, then you'll also rapidly start treating genre conventions as problems with creative solutions. And your version of the genre will be both distinctively personal to you and undeniably belong to the genre. The second purpose of genre for the author is that it enables you to limit and control reader choice. If you knowingly choose your genre, when you do that, readers who knowingly seek it will find your book. But even better than that, the more archetypical your book is, the easier the choice is for the reader, either to read the book or not to read the book. Incidentally, I coined archetypical this afternoon. I don't mean archetypal. By archetypical, I mean typical of the archetype, which may be an unnecessary word. I haven't decided yet. You can argue about that if you like. But what I'm saying is, by making your book resemble what people expect of the genre, it makes it easier for the readers you do want to buy the book, and it also makes it easier for the readers you don't want to avoid it, because it's tremendously important to dodge bad reviews by discouraging readers who are going to hate your book. So this kind of leads me full circle to my final scripted point for the day. And that is this: the blurring of segregation between people, the rise of the ideals of equality, have led many people to believe that while we admit on the one hand all people are different, we accept on the other that all people are basically the same. We're able to maintain this dissonance because the two statements are true and false at different levels of abstraction, at different degrees of granularity. But in most cases, particular tastes, so let's say the taste for urban fantasy, particular tastes are widespread, but not universal. Not everyone likes urban fantasy, but many people do. Is there anything else you can infer about a group of people who all like urban fantasy? I think there's one thing. It's a relatively young genre, so most of the people who both read and write it are going to be under 50 years old. But I highly doubt that you can reliably infer anything else from that. This is a question we will be returning to because before the session somebody tweeted a question which actually goes to this idea of demographics and genre, and I'm sure it's not a question that can be easily settled. What matters, I think, however, what matters is that whatever you write, not everyone is going to like it. In fact, the majority of people probably won't. Authors, especially authors when they're starting out, but to be perfectly honest, I don't think this sensation ever leaves authors. Authors want everyone to like their work. But broad appeal is not something you can aim for. Mass appeal is a lie. Mass appeal isn't created when the book's written, it's created when the book is read. That's probably a good enough line that I can tweet it. I'm going to say this: mass appeal is not created when the book's written. You can't write a book to have mass appeal. Mass appeal happens as a kind of snowball phenomenon. We call it going viral nowadays. It used to be called a fad in advertising. So to try to appeal to as many people as possible is also infirmity of purpose. It will result in mediocrity. The author's first duty to themselves is to write a book that some people will really love. And that means some people will hate it and most people won't care either way. So if you make a decision about genre, it should be that you either choose a definite genre or you choose no genre. But if you do the latter, if you choose no genre, you'll still have to choose one once you come to try to sell your book. So I hope I've managed to say a few things that are sufficiently controversial that it will have stimulated a few questions. And I've just looked in completely the wrong place. There we go. For my there we are. So now, while I'm thinking about some questions that I'm going to answer and looking through anything that you've already asked, and also looking through your snarky comments in the chat, I'm going to ask Craig to tell us a few things about your work in progress, in particular, what genre you think it is,
current work in progress in the genre,
whether it matters,
and
why and how it is the genre that you think it is. So take it away, Craig.
Focus on. I think what I write is science fiction, because technology is always at the heart of the story. If you take the technology away, then there is no story at the end of the day. Someone mentioned Frankenstein in the comments. If you take away Frankenstein's use of technology to reanimate the corpse, then there is no story left. For me, that's science fiction. But a story only about technology isn't very exciting. So I combine that with the human experience to explore how technology will affect my characters, society, and the world, depending on the demands of the story. How can it save us, or even, as most of my work turns out, how will it doom us? Harry mentioned some of my stories, so I'll give you a couple of examples. These range on a bit of a spectrum. So Transmit is what I would typically call hard science fiction, across to The Machine, which is the looser end of the sci-fi spectrum. In Transmit, the core of the story is what if we could download our consciousness into a new body. In the story, this technology is used to save the human race from extinction by beaming our consciousness to another planet and downloading the mind into a new body. The human experience comes from my main character being the first to be beamed across space, leaving her family behind, and then watching the Earth be destroyed from her new home. It sits in the hard end of the sci-fi spectrum because it needs to be believable. So when we're talking about hard science fiction, all of the technology needs to be as realistic as possible. And that type of story demands that type of genre constraint. So even though it was only about 3,000 words, I spent probably longer researching all of the technology to harden the science in the fiction than I did in actually writing the story itself. I had the idea for the story, and then the story itself dictated the genre and the boundaries that the world building must adhere to, and that's quite a sharp contrast with my other story, The Machine. For that one, the what if was, what if you could create a machine that could do anything? What would you use it for? And this time the human experience was based on the disgraced scientist who'd invented it and his thirst for vengeance. However, in this one, it's more on the softer end of the science fiction spectrum. The story would still collapse if you took the technology away, but it also contains a lot of horror, so it's bridging two genres. And the horror aspect actually took me by surprise because I hadn't intended to write it like that. It was originally intended to be, as I say, more on the hard end of the sci-fi spectrum, but when it came to write about the machine itself, the human experience of the twisted and diabolical main character took over, and the machine started to mirror his character. It became something more like something that Cronenberg would dream up. And as I was writing it, it got darker and more sinister. And in the end, the machine was powered by the souls of those who were fed into it, including the main character's wife and child. So it did get really, really dark. So in summary, when we're talking about genre, I currently let the stories themselves direct the boundaries of the world. And for me, that's what dictates the genre. Now, for my current work in progress, that sits firmly in the cyberpunk genre. I didn't set out to write cyberpunk, but once I had the kernel of the idea and I started outlining, I realised that's what it was. Unsurprisingly, cyberpunk's defined by how cyber something is and how punk it is. Cyber being the prevalence of technology, and it generally falls very much into the hard sci-fi end of the spectrum where everything has to be believable. It even comes with a certain expectation of language that's used in the story, like jacking in and cyberspace, that sort of thing. And that's what I did when I was creating it. I took today's technology, extrapolated it out in the future, created a progression of one tech leading to another, like a tech tree for any 4X players out there, that to get where I needed the story to be. And the punk side of things is defined in the true sense of the word of what a punk is. So typically cyberpunk uses the phrase high-tech, low-life to define its genre expectations. The low-lives being the punks of the story, typically down-and-out loser hackers or gang members using technology to get one-up on sinister corporations, for example, fighting from outside the system to overthrow it. The Matrix is a really good example of that. And then there's a second wave of cyberpunk known as post-cyberpunk, and that's still high-tech, but the low-lives being replaced with characters working inside the system to overthrow it. It's a bit more positive than cyberpunk. It doesn't go so hard into the trope of mega corporations that rule everything like cyberpunk does. And that's when I realised I was writing post-cyberpunk and not just cyberpunk. The problem is, from a marketing point of view, that not many people really understand even what cyberpunk is, never mind post-cyberpunk. So when it comes to marketing, I'll be positioning it according to who and where my audience is. So in some cases, I won't even mention post-cyberpunk. Because ultimately, once the story's finished, it doesn't matter whether you've written to market or selected a genre first and then started writing, followed your story and then let it define your genre, or even somewhere between. Eventually it needs to be marketed, and you absolutely need to know the genre it's in, because you need to know how to be able to sell it. And when you're selling, genre dictates everything from things like your Amazon keywords to your categories to the blurb and the cover, basically every facet of your book. And for me, that's why genre matters.
Yeah, you covered quite a lot of ground there.
Some genre, yeah.
There's a lot of common ground between science fiction and cyberpunk. But do you think of do you personally, do you think of cyberpunk as being a subset of science fiction, or do you think of it as a separate genre? Okay, because I tend to think of it as a separate genre. There was would you say cyberpunk typically uses? John is asking us a question in the chat. Naughty John. Because at different times since the second half of the 20th century, there have been like various sort of summaries of the difference between fantasy and science fiction. So one of the most common for a very long time was fantasy is about individuals, science fiction is about societies and cultures. An awful lot of people who don't read either tend to think fantasy is set in the past, science fiction is set in the future. One of my favorite ways of distinguishing between the two, I can't remember whose this is, but said science fiction and fantasy are basically the same stories, but in fantasy most people live in mud huts, and in science fiction they have sliding doors. And I like that because often there's a huge branch of science fiction that I call rockets and ray guns, which is really no different from
looser
things like stories of King Arthur's court, or adventuring roaming gunslingers or adventuring roaming samurai, that I genuinely don't think are science fiction at all, of which obviously the most famous example is Star Wars. when it comes to, I mean, I would describe your work as, and I'm kind of looking forward to your novel coming. In fact, looking forward to seeing the damn thing. But I want to see what kind of reception it gets, because my suspicion is that although among your short stories, there is some, like Transmission is very science fiction. There are some, like The Machine, which is kind of, it's kind of at the,
framework that you can build,
I suppose it's the sort of
around,
Burroughs end of cyberpunky horror. Yeah. So I don't know how many of our listeners are going to have read your short stories, but it's actually the short stories that Craig has done deal with the same kind of general set of themes, but actually treat them in ways that you could argue are either different forms of science fiction or, as I say, are more kind of
looked interesting from my point of view.
horror, more kind of traditional.
For new writers, is aiming to publish a novella, perhaps through a small press.
And I think
the best way to test the order and your skills
it shows really
on a lengthy novel.
Quite well the point that
the answer to that isn't necessarily
what people really want to do is they want to take an
facets
author
to that. So I mean, first of all,
and say this is this author's genre.
In my experience, I think definitely writing short stories.
But actually, what most authors are writing about is a set of ideas.
Learning the craft.
Rather than a genre. It's like an author has a set of ideas that they get out their head, and the genre is then
working with Harry on
just
that story,
the vocabulary they use to do it.
Then you've got the other side of things where, especially if you're going down the self-publishing route, I think creating something small gives you a really good opportunity.
It's the language you use to express your ideas, and so you use what you are comfortable with.
Through every single stage from creating the first draft up to publishing it and
so let's have a look at
through the process of writing the first
Craig,
draft,
you said you spotted some questions among the ones that people sent us in advance that you had some things to say about.
Market it, what the cover looks like, and again, fitting the
so do you want to go ahead and give a couple of answers to those, and then we'll maybe have a rundown of the
correct readers as well.
Increasing number of questions that we've been asked by our guests.
Is aiming to publish a novella, perhaps through a small press, the best way to test the water and your skills before trying to embark on a lengthy novel? And the simple answer to that, I think, is yes, definitely. It actually has, for me anyway, two benefits to be able to publish something shorter to start off with. The first one is, I think it really helps with your ability to create a story. It helps with your craft, going all the way through from having the concept of the story, getting the first draft done, working with a developmental editor on honing the story, and then working with a copy editor on polishing it up, and then a proofreader, throwing in beta readers to the mix. All of those elements really help you go through the life of a story from its initial inception to getting a final draft completed, and doing that for a shorter piece of work compresses all of those steps down into a much smaller time frame compared to writing a novel. And I think that really helps get you through those processes and helps you understand about what each of the stages are, and it means that when you come to do it with something that's a bit larger and maybe a little bit more imposing, like a full novel, it's not quite as scary. You've already been through each of those stages. So I definitely think it helps from a craft point of view. And actually what happened for myself was I got 60,000 words into creating my novel. So didn't freak out, but kind of got concerned that I didn't really know what I was doing, and that's when I discovered Harry's Readworthy Fiction course. So I went away, did his course, created a novella off the back of doing the course, and then that's when I found out about self-publishing, and then found out that I had to, the best way to start a self-publishing career is to start building a mailing list as soon as possible. So instead of returning back to the novel and picking up after the 60,000 words that I'd already done, I instead wrote a novelette of about 10,000 words and 2 short stories of about 3,000, 4,000 words each. And then once I created all of those, I started my website and started finding readers. And only once I'd done all of that, I've returned back to the novel and then completed it for another 110,000 words. So by the time I'd finished it, it was about 170, 180,000 words long. And I'm actually editing it at the moment. And having gone through, the process of creating like I think I've got, so at the moment I've got two novellas parked first draft stage. I've got another 2 short stories that just about finished, and I've got 3 short stories that are out there at the moment. Having been through that process for all of those stories, and now when I'm going through editing, it's plainly obvious how basic some of my writing style was when I was first writing the novel, and it means I'm having to edit it a lot, so I definitely think it'd be worthwhile exploring creating a couple of short stories or maybe a novella. And actually, if you go down the self-publishing route, I can't really speak of how useful it will be through a small press, but if you self-publish it, it'll also take you through all the different aspects of publishing it as well. So you've got the final draft completed, and then you're into the world of you could use that short story or that novella, then start finding readers like I did, use it, start building a mailing list. Then you've got the whole creating an ebook and everything that goes into that, creating a cover, publishing it on Amazon, come up with the keywords, the descriptions, make sure you've got all the metadata correct for your book, and then experiencing all the different aspects of publishing that story. So yeah, I think working on something short is a really, really good idea before you jump into something bigger, for 2 main reasons. One, it improves the craft of writing and gives you a lot of experience of going through all those stages of writing a story. And 2, if you go down the self-publishing route, you also get exposure to all of the different stages of self-publishing, again with something smaller before you jump in with the full novel.
What I was going to add to that is that you makes me. I hope everyone could hear it reasonably well, because there are, when thinking specifically about writing in a genre, that's where, for me, writing short stories and writing novellas before you go into a full-length novel can be especially valuable, because it becomes a means for you to establish your rules, to establish your own genre conventions, and to get a sense of how you want your stories to fit into your chosen genre. And in fact, working with Craig has been, for me, a particularly good example of this, just because of the variety in the short stories that we've worked on. And that's actually in terms of the type of story, the approach to the story, the setting, the overall tone of the stories has varied quite a lot. But it's all fitting into a shared vision, which is, I think, it has, for me, set up some quite specific expectations for what I'm expecting to see when, Craig, you finally feel confident enough to send me your manuscript. So yeah, from that point of view, sorry, I thought that there were an awful lot of questions, but actually I noticed quite a lot of people have been chatting in the question section. So I'm just going to go. I'm going to go down and I'm going to eventually go down and make some of those disappear so that I don't get too confused. But I want to go. I want to go back to some questions that were submitted over the course of yesterday and today. I'm just going to take these one by one. The first one that came in seemed like quite an odd question to start with. Can a person successfully write genre fiction if they almost never read the genre? And I think that there are genres where you have an awareness of what makes it, and an awareness also of what other people will make it. What defines a genre is not so much rules as conventions. And so I suppose the risk from working that way, the risk is that the other thing that happens in genre is that it evolves. So, if you were to read something like heroic fantasy from, let's say, in fact, you could take any decade of the 20th century, because there was heroic fantasy throughout the 20th century. So you could take like any of the last 12 decades, and you will see changes in the way that stories are presented. You'll see changes in the way in which they are. So when I say presented, what I mean in that case is the way in which they are presented to the public. So the way in which they are sold, the way that they're described by publishers, the way they're described in reviews, in blurbs, and so on. You'll also see changes in the types of characters. You'll see changes in, if we're talking about fantasy, in things like the role of magic in stories. Right at the beginning of the 20th century, magic was pretty much the preserve of the bad guys. Then you got this movement to where you started seeing things like magical weapons being used by heroes, but not heroes actually using magic. And there's this big dramatic pivot point that happens sometime between the 1970s and the 1980s, where everyone's suddenly allowed to use magic in heroic fantasy. But there are a lot of other changes that take place. And if you're not up to date with the contents of the genre that you're writing in, then you can definitely end up looking a lot more out of date if you are aiming for an older version of the genre that you're writing in. Now I noticed that Anna has asked a question about the maximum length of a series, and I also had a question. We also had a question asked about the maximum or the typical lengths of particular kinds of genre fiction, and whether there are lengths to write to. And it's very easy to say how long is a piece of string, but really the difference in terms of the answer to this question, the difference is not so much from one genre to the next, as whether you are self-publishing or traditionally publishing. Because if you are hoping to publish traditionally and you're not already established, then there are, I wouldn't say exactly rules, but there are sensible guidelines to follow with regard to the length of the stories that you're writing. Just to give you a few examples, in general, the first novel you try to get a representation for from an agent in almost any genre should be in the kind of like 75 to 100,000 word range. But there are genres that tolerate shorter lengths. There are genres that tolerate longer ones. So police procedurals, for instance, typically tolerate a shorter length, as do quite a lot of crime dramas, and cozies tolerate a shorter length, romances tolerate a shorter length. Then there are other genres that tolerate longer lengths, like fantasy, like certain types of science fiction tolerates a longer overall length. When it comes to series length, if you are thinking about traditionally publishing, really the one rule is don't try to sell an incomplete series. It's unbelievably difficult to get representation if you have planned out a trilogy but you've only written the first book.
I was just going to chip
Whereas
in
if you've written a trilogy and it is
well,
complete as a trilogy,
what the structure of
then
the
you
series
can
is.
absolutely
so, like Jim Butcher's Dresden
start
Files
pitching the first book
is a
to
series
agents.
of books, but it's each story's
but is there a maximum
encapsulated
length
a single story?
to
It's
a
one character that
series?
persists throughout the whole
Not
series.
really.
And there's what, 20 or 30
I personally
different Dresden Files
think,
books or something
and
like
this
that.
is like a an editor writing coach point of view here, rather than a reader or even a writer one. I personally think that a meaningful series shouldn't be more than 3 books, because I don't think that you can. I don't think you can tell a story that covers more than 3 books in a really coherent way, unless you're one of those people who's already written 30 to 50 books. Because the more books you write, the easier it is to think in terms of telling a story over multiple books. But also, the more books you write, the more consistent your writing is. So if you've written between 25 and 50 books, then over the next 5 books you write, the overall quality of your writing, your general level of skill and ability, the natural flow of your writing, the style, the voice, all of that stuff is not going to change very much. Whereas if you've only written 2 or 3 books and you decide you're going to write a series of 10, there will be an absolutely gigantic difference in quality between the first book and the 10th one. And so at that point, I think it's kind of a bad idea. So I've just noticed John saying, should he scale it back from 10? We'll talk about this tomorrow, John, but I do think that you're tending to think about a longer story. But people will a longer story than perhaps you should. But the thing is, often, particularly when you're writing an epic, so John is writing epic fantasy, and when you're writing an epic, you do think in terms of the amount of time this is going to take and the amount of things that I need to convey to the reader about this mean that it's going to be 10 books, 15 books, 20 books. And maybe it will be.
So just
maybe
to
it will
on the
be.
question about writing in series, I'd just like to add that the general approach for self-publishing, in case anyone's not aware, is to aim for a trilogy. It's definitely the sweet spot between sales and coherence of an arc, aiming for 3 books. But the other thing to chip in is that you can have a series with no overall arc and have the character experience different stories each time. Then it's more of a matter of how long you can keep it interesting and how long readers will keep reading. Jim Butcher's The Dresden Files is a good example of that. He's got a 15-book series going with his main character, Harry Dresden. And then, just to throw in a curveball, I'm currently up to book 22 of the Horus Heresy series. That series goes back in time and explores the backstory to the world as it's being told now. It actually goes up to book 50, and they still aren't done. So just to be extra unhelpful, sometimes the answer is, it depends.
Yeah, absolutely. It does depend on whether you're telling multiple stories, like in a single world with the same character. And if you are in a genre where people actually prefer it that way, and crime is a good example, then yeah, it can be stretched out to quite a large number of books. I'm conscious of the time and wanting to get everyone's questions answered. And there was one that I was asked earlier, which was about the relationship between genre and demographics, because this was saying, in general, are the demographics of the readers of particular genres known? And there certainly used to be a lot of stereotypes around the demographics for particular genres. But the demographics, as far as it's possible to tell, and it is very limited, incidentally, how far it's possible to tell, partly because the people who these days have the statistics are not sharing them, and because in the past they were just very difficult to get. But mostly it was based on stereotypes. People used to think, for instance, that the readers of heroic fantasy were all teenage boys. People used to think that the readers of romance were all women. Do you say of a certain age in English? You say that in French. Women of a certain age. And yes, thank you. And although for romance that's certainly broadly true and seems always to have been broadly true, For most genres, the genre tends to reflect the demographic of the authors. If you want to know what the demographic for a particular genre is, look at the 100 or so top authors, find out as much as you can about them, and that will tell you a great deal about the readers. Readers, it's like dogs and their owners. Readers tend to resemble their authors. The romance writers all look like Fabio. I don't know who Fabio is, I'm afraid. Am I missing out on some piece of popular culture? Don't look it up, he says. I'm going to have a look, have another scan down your questions. A couple of remarks about covers. I'm just looking for lots of complaints about Craig's audio. Ah, yes. So Matt says, does every genre have obligatory scenes? And this is one of those questions that depends a great deal on it depends a great deal on, if you like, the genre definers that defined the idea of genre in the first place. I've just finished working on, I'll tell you a little bit about it later on, but I've just finished working on a new course which is kind of, at least in part, inspired by Carol Newsom, who's, are you still with us, Carol? This, I wrote a course called How to Write a Cozy Mystery. Yay! And the genre definer for cozy mysteries is Agatha Christie. And whenever people write parodies of Agatha Christie, they put in certain kinds of scenes. And the really shocking thing is that when you read Christie, and I've read all of them multiple times, because I think there are very few writers who are better than she is, when you actually look at them, you actually discover that an awful lot of the scenes that people write parodies of, the parodies are not as self-parodic as Agatha Christie's own books. And so if you write a country house murder mystery and the mystery is being solved by a great detective, you're likely to get into trouble with readers if you don't have a scene where everyone is gathered together in a room, sitting in old, antique, comfortable furniture, with a fire in the grate, and the great detective striding,
how's the audio first?
or as it might be, waddling around the room, describing how the crime played out and gradually springing his trap. And I think because
do you want to answer it then?
Established such a lot of archetypes that were then imitated by such a lot of other people, to some extent, people think, yeah, in certain very narrowly defined genres. So if we say the country house murder mystery, there are some scenes that feel like they are obligatory. And in fact, an awful lot of the ideas that people have about how to write a story, particularly things that are used in screenwriting, like 3-act structure, actually derive directly from I'm going to use the bad word. They derive from the tropes that were established by the likes of Agatha Christie, Marjorie Allingham, Dorothy L. Sayers, when at the height of the cozy mystery pulp boom. But I think that I don't think all genres have obligatory scenes, and I think that there are plenty of genres where it can kind of go in almost any direction. Most of the time, if there are obligatory scenes, it's because something's gone wrong. So, okay, another great example is an awful lot of people who want to find like the best way to write the best piece of heroic fantasy. What they think is, oh, you have to write the hero's journey. And poor Joseph Campbell had, I think, no idea that he was going to that his work was going to be used so thoroughly inappropriately. But people think that the hero's journey is a kind of a prescription for how to write a great piece of heroic fantasy, when in fact what it's supposed to be is a description of common elements in cultural myths about male heroes. And it's almost certainly best if you don't think about there being specific scenes that have to fit into a particular genre. Tony Sangster says, are tropes for dopes? Which, oh, Craig, you've answered this in a comment. Do you want to tell us aloud what you've said about Tony's question? Oh, well, it's very torn up for me. Cyberpunky, John says the audio is. Choppy as the North Sea. Yeah, well, I'll just read out what Craig has said. So Craig says it's a tricky one because there are certain tropes in genres that people expect, but that it can be tricky to work out which ones they are. And Craig has said there's a certain mode of thinking in self-publishing where you write specifically to cater to a genre. He says, have a look at Chris Fox's Right to Market. In fact, I mean, I tend to think that the thinking about writing to genre is even more prevalent in traditional publishing. But to be perfectly honest, if what you are interested in is establishing a revenue stream, then catering directly to genre, finding out what the tropes are, finding out what people's specific expectations are, is definitely the way to go. So yeah, Anna has just commented in the chat here that that's kind of the opposite of what she did. She had her mad idea and ran with it. And I think that Anna has kind of invented a genre on her own. But it's one that I hope will take off because it's great fun. But this is kind of where I've been going with this whole idea of genre fiction, is that I think that authors who manage to think about their work as a business, even if you just manage to think of it as a way of earning some pocket money, I think that all authors should practice having your magnum opus on the go, and at the same time, on the other hand, to be working on something that's written to market, something that's going to be simple, that's going to be relatively short, where you're going to be able to have quite a high production rate, quite low production costs, something where, for instance, you won't need a developmental editor, where all you want is just to belt out 50, 60,000 words, send it to a copy editor, slap a pre-made cover on it, and get it bringing in the money, building the backlist, and so on. The ideal for that, obviously, is something that is in a genre that's closely related to your passion project. Because I don't think you should devote yourself, effectively what I'm saying is I don't think you should ever devote yourself entirely to one or the other. I think that if you want to, so yeah, Anna, you should write Twinkly Vampires to make some money, basically, and then you can work on your yeah. I mean, how do you describe alternate history that's based in mythology? It's like alternate mythology, is it? I don't know what to call Anna's actual genre. But I think all writers should practice working on the thing you love to make it as great as it can possibly be, but also working on things that you think will sell. And also, and the other major reason for this is that building up your sales over time is about building up your backlist. It's about having a nice long list of things that are relatively easy to sell in terms of the fact that you can relatively easily describe them, that if you decide to do like a mass mailing marketing technique, that you can relatively easily target them by genre and so on. So I diverged quite a long way there. I'm kind of going down the questions again. Had some questions which Craig has been furiously answering. So John says, can't it be severely limiting to exactly claim your genre when pitching to an agent, such as grimdark or high fantasy, rather than just saying fantasy? No, it's the opposite. The more narrowly you can claim, you can describe your genre when you are pitching to anyone. So whether you are sending out an email to your mailing list, or whether you are whether you've taken part in an anthology and so you're sharing mailing lists with people who write similar stuff to you, the more narrowly you can identify your genre, the easier it is for the person that you're pitching to take a decision. So, and I think that this idea, oh, I mustn't limit myself by narrowing it down, it's that same counterintuitive thing of thinking I'll sell more if I can have if I can appeal to more people. But just remember this, the broader you try to make something, the more difficult you make it for people to take a decision. I mean, if you think about fantasy, think about all the books that you've read that you could describe as fantasy and how different they all are. And then think about the last fantasy book you read. And how would you be able to find something similar to that if all you said about it was that it was fantasy? It's not enough. It needs to be as narrow as you can possibly make it. Tony says, seems to me the book cover is an important part of marketing, attracting readers. No, the book, and it looks like Craig's, we've got several people answering and discussing here. John says, you need it. I'm reading this out incidentally in case you don't, quite a lot of people who listen to the replay will just listen to the audio, which is the reason why I'm reading out quite a lot of this stuff.
Okay.
John says, how many people would buy a coverless book? People are visual by default. Craig says, yes, the cover is critical for the reader to identify the genre. General rule of thumb is that each genre has a certain set of conventions. So space opera is currently spaceships with big asses, as they're fond of saying in some Facebook groups. Yes, and just like the unpleasant truth about covers is that each time you go up a factor of 10 in the amount you spend on your cover art, you will increase the reach. So there's very little difference in reach between a $50 cover and a $100 cover. But if you go from a $50 to a $500 cover, you will get more people paying attention to your book. And if you go up to a $5,000 cover, then again, you will get a lot more people looking at your book. Covers make a lot more difference than you think they ought to. Tony says, difference between rules and conventions. I don't want to get philosophical. But when it comes to genre, conventions are the things that everyone expects to be in there. The rules are the things that shouldn't be there. So I'm just keeping an eye on the time, and I want to make sure that that we answer as many of the things that have come through as possible. I'm skipping a couple of questions here because they aren't really sufficiently genre based. One of the other questions I got earlier was, can you list the rules of each genre, or is it impossible? I personally think that genre evolves too much for it to be meaningful. And I think that in most cases, I think you can go on instinct in most cases. Okay, so I'm laughing at some comments in your questions. Just having a quick look at the time. Okay, Craig, is there anything you wanted to add to any of that? Oh, it's still tearing an awful lot. Okay, never mind. So, all right then, we've reached an hour, and I've got a few things that I just want to mention to those of you who are still with me, and also, of course, for the use of anyone who comes to the replay. So, first of all, an announcement. I mentioned my new course, How to Write Cozy Mysteries. It's going to be launched probably early next week. I say probably because it has to go through an approval process. I never know exactly how long that's going to take. This is a course that's all about the power of genre, although it centers around cozy mysteries and how to write them. But I think there are valuable lessons for all writers. I wanted to say that all the guests to this particular Moatcast, if you go down to the bottom of the screen where the questions are and you click on the Offers tab, you'll now see it says How to Write Cozy Mysteries Free Pass. And there's a button there, it says click to register. So if you go down there, you click to register, it'll take you to a page where you can put in your email address, and then when the course goes live, you will automatically get a free coupon to the Cozy Mysteries course. So in a moment, I'm going to activate another offer, which is for my author coaching, Castle Dewulf. Castle Dewulf author coaching is all about applying my experience and knowledge to your development as an author. So the kind of coaching I offer is specifically and only for you, and I'll only offer it to you if I'm sure you're ready to do what you need to do to go from what I call damage limitation writing to building a true mastery of your craft. Those of you who were with me last time, you will have heard some of this before, but not all of it. I'm probably going to have to say this in every Moatcast that I do. So here we go. Castle Dewulf author coaching is available in 3, 6, or 12-month packages. Detailed pricing information is available when you click the Reserve Now button at the bottom of the screen. If you book your free consultation now, you'll be eligible for an extra month of free coaching, no matter which package you choose. This offer is available only if you book your free consultation using this button, which is going to appear in just a moment. Oh, and it actually says find out more. So this is also in the offers section. It says get into Castle Dewulf. If you click on the find out more button, then you can reserve a free coaching consultation. Folks, today what I wanted to do is show you a couple of things. The first one is that talking about writing issues live, whether one-to-one or in a group, is a highly effective way to improve your understanding of the art and business of writing. Taking a broad topic like genre fiction is a way of showing just how interconnected are the many aspects of fiction writing. Genre takes account of the needs of the reader, the desires of the bookseller, and the duties of the author, but also shows the author has to know how to think like all three. The author has to know how to think like an author, like a reader, like a bookseller. This kind of thinking is just as important inside the covers of your book as outside. It's as important in the creation of your story as it is in selling your finished book. It's not easy to learn, and I don't think it can be learned fast. So getting to the other side of the moat, getting into Castle Dewulf, is a matter of showing me your commitment, your determination, your motivation, your ambition. Talent alone isn't enough. I have to be convinced that you're ready to do the work, sometimes hard work, though I think most of my authors will agree that it's usually fun. I have to be convinced that you're ready to do the work necessary to take your writing to the next level, to fulfill the potential I see in all of... I feel like I should say that line with an American accent, to fulfill the potential I see in all of you, because it's not a very British thing to say. I also want to show you that genre is not a dirty word. It's nothing to be ashamed of, but it's nothing to be proud of either. It's just a tool, a technique, a means to an end, both creative and commercial. So the decisions you take about it should be taken with an open mind and a clear conscience. The decisions you take should satisfy your creative needs, but also your economic necessities. Thank you, everyone, for sharing your time and your thoughts. Thank you for Craig for joining us. Maybe next time we will be able to we'll be able to get over the technical issues with your audio, and people will be able to listen to your I'm trying to think of a poetic way of describing Craig's beautiful regional accent. But to be fair, it's not very strong. So can you do a stronger version of it, Craig? Maybe you'll have to do that next time. So the next Moatcast will be on or around April 23rd, because I'm going to be traveling later in the month. It'll be a live lesson entitled The Last Word on POV. I intend to put the discussion of points of view to bed for good. I obviously am not going to succeed, but you will learn how to see the issue of POV clearly, to dismiss doubt, to take informed decisions. It's also going to run at a slightly later time, but there'll be an announcement about it roughly 10 days beforehand, as usual. So thanks everyone for joining us. Thank you, Craig, for joining me. Pity we couldn't hear more from you, but the audio was good enough during the first part when you were talking about your book, so I hope that that's been interesting and useful to everyone.